After decades of government corruption and economic destabilization, most major nations began to descend into widespread chaos at the end of the 20th century. Here is the timeline of events that led to the dark future of Cyberpunk. In 1990, the First Central American War explodes. It will last 4 years. The United States engaged in military actions in Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. To disguise these imperialist ambitions, the United States claimed to be fighting against communists and drug traffickers. Wounded U.S. Army soldiers being brought home is driving up the demand for cybernetic implants, a rapidly growing industry. On the other side of the globe, the Soviet bloc collapses, forced to move closer to Europe to get out of the crisis. Strengthened by this unexpected alliance, Europe created the EEC, European Economic Community, in which East and West Germany were reunited. The main member countries are France, Germany, Great Britain, Benelux, and Italy, but to everyone's surprise, Japan is also integrated, destroying any hope for an alliance with the USA. As for Greece and Spain, overwhelmed by the crisis, they did not meet the conditions necessary to integrate this new union. The signatories adopted a common currency, the eurodollar, which, thanks to the sudden economic expansion of the old continent, would soon become the only currency on the planet. The USA, worried by this rise in power of the EEC, will quickly harden its relations with it, and thus begins what has been called the Silent War, a kind of new Cold War, during which the Americans will launch clandestine operations on the European territory to try to destabilize it. The operation was a failure, reinforcing on the contrary the European unity and leading to the dissolution of NATO. Meanwhile, Africa is divided in two. On the one hand, North and Central Africa, which are experiencing unprecedented development, providing the necessary manpower for the multiple orbital station projects, and benefiting from the creation, in Kenya, of Orbital Air, a corporation specializing in aerospace transport. On the other hand, South Africa, which is sinking completely into chaos. All lines of communication are cut and rumors are circulating about a possible genocide. Finally, it was also in 1990 that businessman Richard Knight launched his project to create a utopian city, focused on the happiness and security of its inhabitants, isolated from the chaos that was growing in the rest of the country. After several studies, the place chosen for the construction of this ideal city is Morro Bay, along the coast of Central California, and Richard Knight names the city Coronado City. With the support of many corporations, mainly the Texan Petrochem, the French IBM and the American Merrill, Asukaga and Finch, work began at the end of 1990. In order to ensure the safety of the workers, who were prey to gang attacks, the Japanese firm Arasaka was called in and integrated into the project. All these megacorporations will of course have a place of choice in Corporate Plaza, the ultramodern business center planned in the city center. In 1991, determined to win the race to conquer space, the ESA, European Space Agency, created the new Hermes shuttle. It will accelerate the development of the numerous infrastructures to come. Meanwhile, a small chemical company based in Rome, Italy, and called Biotecnica, makes an invention that will change the world. Triticum vulgaris megasuavis, which includes in its secret formula a sequence of CHOOH2 molecules, and which will soon be nicknamed Choo Choo, is an alcohol obtained from cereals, produced by genetic yeasts and wheat plants. In just a few years, all the vehicles on the planet will be adapted to use this new technology, which will quickly become the main energy resource, making Biotecnica a super powerful megacorporation. From its headquarters in Rome, the company will successively establish itself in London, Bonn, Paris, Seattle, Dallas, Sydney, and Rio de Janeiro. On the American side, both because of the economic crisis and the protests against the war in Central America, riots multiplied in urban areas, leading to the acceleration of another innovation, the aerodynes, authentic flying vehicles favored by the development of the choo-choo. Within a few months, the skies were suddenly blackened with flying vehicles in federal police colors. Finally, in 1991, the first large arcology was created in New Jersey. An arcology is a city, or a huge structure, which, through an intensified ultramodern agricultural activity and an advanced recycling system, is self-sufficient. The city feeds its inhabitants, who very often cut themselves off from the rest of the world. In 1992, the fight against drugs became a priority for the US government, as the traffic put many cities to fire and blood, and mainly Miami, which sank into chaos. In response, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, released a chemical substance around the world that targeted and destroyed opium, cannabis, and coca plantations. In a matter of weeks, all the resources of drug traffickers around the world were reduced to dust. The governments of Chile, Ecuador, and Afghanistan collapsed almost instantly, and numerous armed conflicts emerged between the DEA and the major drug cartels. In 1993, while James Richard Allen had just been elected 42nd President of the United States, in retaliation for the American attacks on Bogota, the Colombian drug barons detonated a small nuclear bomb in New York, killing 15,000 people according to the authorities, and many more according to the inhabitants. It is rumored that the cartel had the discreet support of the European Council, probably responding to the American clandestine operations against Europe in the framework of the Silent War. The bomb exploded in Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, causing widespread damage throughout the city and leaving a large area of radiation for many years. Midtown Manhattan became the scene of urban warfare, with small pockets of civilization spread across the north and south of the island. Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, spared by the explosion, are now home to most of New York's population. 1994 marks the beginning of the so-called collapse. The United States is caught using illegal computer methods to manipulate the American and European stock markets. The information, made public, causes a financial meltdown around the world. The stock market crash is unprecedented. In the United States, the number of homeless people in the streets explodes. The country counts 21 million. The technical revolutions that accentuate economic inequalities give rise to two radically opposed social classes. On one side, the wealthy population of corporatists, eager for material wealth. On the other, a poor working class, victim of economic instability. The middle class has almost disappeared. It was also in 1994 that an accident in a thermonuclear plant almost wiped the city of Pittsburgh off the map, causing the direct death of 257,000 people, and increasing the number of cancer cases in the following years. The site of the city has since been nicknamed the Pit, and it will take years for the nomads of the Aldecaldo clan to come and rebuild it. On the West Coast, the building of Coronado City is completed and the town is inaugurated by Richard Knight, who hopes to develop a haven of peace there. On its side, the Soviet Union, enlarging its alliance with the EC, changes its status and becomes the USSR, Union of Sovereign Soviet Republics. 1995 is marked by a huge civil war in China, during which the armed group of the Maoist loyalist cabal gradually takes possession of large parts of the territory, imposing on the population the strict rules of a radical Maoism. In 1996, the losses caused by the stock market crash weakened many American cities. Overwhelmed by unemployment, rising homelessness, and corruption, they were either bankrupt or falling apart one by one. The United States is on the verge of collapse. On August 17th, the Gang of Four, a coalition of government agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, and DEA, determined to restore order, launched a coup d'etat that put an end to the federal democracy of the United States. President James Richard Allen and Vice President Harold Harrison Hunt were assassinated. Jonathan Seward, Secretary of Defense, suspended the U.S. Constitution, instituted martial law, and took the vacant seat of President of the United States, supported by the Gang of Four, which became autonomous and, through him, led the federal government alone. Many states, refusing to submit to the initiators of this coup, began to ignore federal authority and declared themselves free states. Texas was the first, becoming the Free Republic of Texas, followed by Alaska, California, Nevada, and Utah. In the midst of this chaos, 1 in 4 Americans is homeless. Hundreds of thousands of protests for the right to have a place to live are breaking out across the country. Driven from their farms by the economic crisis and the sandstorms brought on by global warming, entire families are adopting a nomadic lifestyle, congregating on the West Coast in ever larger clans. It was also in 1996 that the phenomenon of booster gangs began to develop, ultra-violent street gangs, boosted by cybernetic technology, whose abuse often causes them to fall into cyberpsychosis, and which wage merciless territorial wars. In 1997, the crisis in the Middle East, caused by the gradual abandonment of oil in favor of the choo-choo, leads to a dramatic escalation of tensions, which ends in a real thermonuclear war. Iran, Iraq, Chad, Libya, and the Arab Emirates are reduced to dust, leaving very few survivors in the most isolated regions. It is estimated that more than 120 million people died. The environmental disaster is having repercussions as far away as the United States. In the Midwestern states, many modest towns, already in bankruptcy, are being swept away between floods and dust storms. The last inhabitants flee. As soon as the dust storms are over, Petrochem, Conag, and Biotechnica take advantage of the opportunity to buy up these huge tracts of abandoned land for a ridiculous price and create vast agricultural complexes, run by machines and day laborers, under the protection of heavily armed guards. In the devastated region, highways became battlefields as packs of boosters traveled from city to city, looting everything in their path. To deal with this rise in violence, the U.S. Army founded the COGS, Combined Operation Groups, armed intervention groups divided by region, which assumed both a law enforcement and military operations role. In 1998, an earthquake of magnitude 10.5 devastated Los Angeles. In less than an hour, the Pacific Ocean swallowed up 35% of the city, which suffered about 65,000 victims, a rather moderate death toll, due to the fact that the local population had long been preparing for the big one. The humanitarian catastrophe was nevertheless immense. The military bases were washed away, preventing the federal government from maintaining order and organizing relief efforts. After a few weeks of total chaos, the government called upon the nomadic clans of the Jodes Nation, which would take 3 years to repair the damage. At the same time, in Kentucky, the Ludds, a neo-Luddite activist movement opposed to modernization and technological development, preaching a return to natural life, developed rapidly and began a series of bombings that will last for nearly 10 years. As for Coronado City, the town founded by Richard Knight, things are much more complicated than expected. For 4 years, despite the resistance of the corporations, the mafia has been trying to take over the ultramodern city. Richard Knight, refusing to negotiate with the mob, was murdered on September 20th, 1998, in his penthouse of the Parkview Tower. The emotion in the city was immense, and a few days later, in his memory, the city council renamed Coronado City to Night City. In the USSR, the petrochemical industry is brought together in a single national entity, Sovoil, which will soon undergo a phenomenal expansion and become the country's main source of income. In Great Britain, the only country in the EC not to have been spared the riots that followed the collapse, martial law was finally introduced as well, forcing King Charles III into exile with his family. Finally, in 1998, work began on the Great Transcontinental Rail Transport Project, maglev. Its shuttles, thanks to the advent of electrodynamic suspension technology, will allow for comfortable travel at very high speeds, reaching 500 kilometers per hour, and will link the east and west coasts of the United States, from Night City to Washington, D.C., via Atlanta and St. Louis. In 1999, Europe completes the construction of its lunar colony, named Tycho, and builds in the Canary Islands a mass driver, an electromagnetic catapult which allows to propel very quickly raw materials between the Earth, the orbital stations, and the moon. While the situation on the ground calmed down very slightly, the American government, still in the hands of the Gang of Four, put an end to martial law. A short break, since it will be reinstated a few months later. In the year 2000, millenarian sects flourish across the planet, predicting the coming of the apocalypse. In a collective delirium, thousands of people begin to migrate to isolated communities and temples to wait for the end of the world. The millenarian cults went mad and caused waves of suicides and violence. In Berlin, 19,000 people died in a chemical attack by a millenarian cult. On the American side, in November, Jonathan Seward, still president, was assassinated. He was urgently replaced by General William Newell, who had been heading the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That year, the Europeans began construction of the Crystal Palace space station at Lagrange Point 1. Lagrange points, described as early as 1772 by the scientist Joseph Louis de Lagrange, are privileged points in space where the gravity fields of the Earth and the Sun combine to provide a point of equilibrium for a third body of negligible mass. In short, ideal situations for geostationary stations such as the Crystal Palace. In 2001, the architecture of the net was completed with the construction of a global satellite network by the French megacorporation WorldSat Communications Network. It is, after the invention of the choo-choo, the greatest technological revolution of modern times, which will change the daily life of billions of inhabitants by offering unprecedented possibilities of information exchange and remote control of computers and electronic devices. But above all, it is a revolution that will accelerate the megacorporations' rise and allow them to increase their hold on the population. In 2001, the American weapon companies Armatech and Luchesi merged to form Militech, the only arms and security megacorporation likely to be able to compete, one day, with the Japanese giant Arasaka. That year, finally, in Great Britain, the army took advantage of the martial law that had been in place for 3 years to launch a coup d'etat and put a real end to the monarchy. In 2002, the leaders of the Soviet petrochemical industry Sovoil, which has grown steadily to become the main economic force of the USSR, suddenly declare their independence, making Sovoil a self-managed megacorporation, refusing to submit to the laws of the country and the authority of the state. This was a violent blow to the political power, and the Soviet President Gorbachev was forced to resign. The same year, ESA creates Copernicus, its second colony on the surface of the moon. In 2003, the Second Central American War began. It lasted 7 years. The Gang of Four sent American troops in the hope of invading Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. The operation was a real disaster that cost the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers. On all fronts, the army was bogged down. It was a hard blow for the Gang of Four, which was unable to find an exit from the crisis. General William Newell, acting president since 2000, and supported by the army, found an opportunity there to finally dismantle the Gang of Four. He passed a series of reforms that strengthened federal power. In 2004, the first corporate war broke out. It lasted a whole year. The commando operations and hacking attacks on cyberspace between the French EBM and the Kenyan Orbital Air, fighting for the purchase of the TWA airline, marked the entry of the world into the era of open warfare between corporations. The two giants were engaged in a merciless war on all the terrains where they had facilities, in America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. While the country was still under martial law, Colonel Henry Jacobi was nominated by the Army to take over the position of President of the United States from retiring General William Newell. In 2005, the cyberdeck was invented, allowing its users to connect directly to the net through a neural implant, multiplying phenomenally the speed and possibilities of online operations. The complex mastery of the neural connection is, however, reserved for connoisseurs, who are called netrunners. After losing hundreds of millions of Eurodollars, the two megacorporations EBM and Orbital Air put an end to the first corporate war. But they had paved a path that many others would soon follow. In Night City, the Mafia's attacks had finally paid off, giving it absolute control over the city after infiltrating the city council. A dark era began, called the mob rule. It lasted until 2009. The city became a hub for drug trafficking and prostitution, gradually dragging this town that was once a paradise into a violent civil war. On November 5th, the newly appointed U.S. President, Henry Jacoby, was assassinated in the street. Suspicions quickly turned to a megacorporation. The army deployed colossal resources to investigate. In 2006, the first human clone was created in vitro. It survived only 6 hours. The Army's investigation into the assassination of President Jacoby finally led to the identification of its sponsors, Mantoga, an arms corporation that felt aggrieved by the advent of Militech, and to whom the government had refused to grant legislative flexibility. In an unprecedented show of force, called Operation Big Stick, the U.S. military ordered Mantoga's executives to leave the country within 4 hours. When they refused to comply, the U.S. military destroyed all of the megacorporation's assets and executed all of its board members within 12 hours. This intervention was a clear message from the U.S. military to the megacorporations of the world. There were limits to what could be done. That year, in the USSR, the Sovoil Corporation, which had become independent, bought Biotechnica's patent in order to be able to produce choo-choo, which would further increase its development. In 2007, the second corporate war began. This one lasted 3 years. The Soviet company Sovoil and the Texan company Petrochem fought mercilessly for the exploitation of a new oil field discovered in the South China Sea. Even the most cynical observers were shocked by the degree of violence that resulted. On the other side of the world, the Maoist loyalist cabal, whose power had expanded, launched an assault on Hong Kong and took control. In 2008, the USA launched an assault on the Russian space weapon platform Mir-13. The European Space Agency intervened and the orbital war broke out between the Euros and the Yankees. The conflict worsened day by day until the European government decided to use the mass driver of its Tycho lunar base to bring down a 2-ton rock on Colorado Springs. In the space of barely a second, the American city was wiped off the map. Stunned by the shock, the USA agreed to sign a peace agreement. In 2009, an alleged terrorist group failed to take over the Crystal Palace, the European space station still under construction. The ESA investigated and discovered that the US government was the real sponsor of this failed attack and, as a warning, projected a new 5-ton rock, this time off the coast of Washington, D.C. The message was very clear, and the weapon of mass deterrence most effective. In September, as public anger mounted over its foolish foreign policies, the U.S. government was forced to reorganize and schedule the first regular elections since the imposition of martial law in 1996. Mike Blair was elected president and announced in his first speech that he was ending martial law. Everyone tried to believe that a new era was coming. In Night City, the megacorporations joined forces to get rid of the mafia. Over the next 2 years, under the leadership of Arasaka's overtrained troops, a series of attacks, bombings, shootings, and assassinations decimated the ranks of the mafia. The corrupt city council was disbanded and replaced by new councilors, led by a mayor in thrall to the megacorporations. Gentrification and the sudden explosion of rents, however, put a large number of residents on the streets, and Night City quickly became one of the cities with the highest rate of homelessness. During this time, the ESA joined the USSR to launch their first mission to Mars. Finally, in 2009, Yuriko Sugimoto, a young student at the University of California at Santa Cruz, invented braindance. This technology, using neural plugs, allows any person to relive the memory, the sensitive and emotional experience of another person. Used first by the government for the reconditioning of criminals, and by Militech to set up military training simulations, Sugimoto, who kept his patent, created Braindance Incorporated, a corporation intended for the entertainment for the general public. In 2010, human clones were now viable, but there was no technology that could give them a personality or any form of intelligence. They were primarily used as organ donors for the wealthy. After 7 years of stalemate and tens of thousands of soldiers killed in vain, the US government finally decided to put an end to the Second Central American War. The management of the end of the crisis was catastrophic. More than 1 million mercenaries were abandoned by the government. Forced to return home on foot, they began what would be called the Long Walk, which would last more than 2 years, and lead many of these former soldiers into nomadic culture. On the European side, ESA launched the construction of its first O'Neill-type space colony at Lagrange 5, a cylindrical space habitat allowing the creation of a large-scale colony. It was simply called O'Neill 1. In 2011, the Crystal Palace space station is completed at Lagrange 1. Between the Tycho moon base, the Mars missions and this new orbital station, everything seems to indicate that Europe has definitely won the space war. In 2012, Chicago is hit by a huge bioplague caused by an accident in a biochemical research complex at the university. The tragedy will lead to the direct death of more than 200,000 inhabitants and destroy almost the entire city. Until 2020, Chicago will remain a ghost town, haunted by a toxic cloud. The Long Walk ended that year. Only 10% of the soldiers managed to return home. The rest died on the road or joined the ranks of various nomadic clans, in particular those of the Meta Nation, off the coast of Panama, the vast majority of whose members are former military. In 2013, NetWatch, a net surveillance agency, which was previously a private company, became an official institution operating worldwide, following a treaty ratified by both Europe and the United States. Despite this increased surveillance of the net, the netrunner Rach Bartmoss secretly introduced Data Crash, a virus which, years later, would lead to its total destruction. Meanwhile, the first true autonomous artificial intelligence, in other words, someone like me, was being designed at Microtech's California facility in Sunnyvale. President Mike Blair was re-elected for the second time. It is also in 2013 that a very famous event of the cyberpunk culture took place. Alt Cunningham, a netrunner and girlfriend of rocker Johnny Silverhand, invented a fearsome virus called Soul Killer, capable of frying the entire brain of any netrunner it attacks after saving a disk image of it. Having written this devastating code only as a challenge, the young woman refused to spread it and swore never to use it. A few weeks after her exploit was revealed to the netrunner community, Alt Cunningham was suddenly kidnapped by Arasaka, who hold her in the Night City Arasaka Tower, trying to steal her secret. Furious, Johnny Silverhand organized a huge concert at the bottom of the tower as a sign of protest. Taking advantage of the riot, he tried to free his girlfriend from the Arasaka complex. The operation was a failure, resulting in the death of Alt Cunningham, and Johnny Silverhand, devastated, was forced to flee the country to escape the troops of Arasaka and hide in Mexico among the members of the nomadic clan of Aldecaldos. Legend has it, however, that Alt Cunningham's spirit, saved by her own soul killer program, is still very much with us, wandering the halls of the net like a ghost. In 2014, with the dissolution of the Mafia having given them free rein, numerous booster gangs developed in Night City and fought a merciless territorial war, known as the Metal War. In China, the People's Liberation Party gradually regained power over the areas controlled by the Maoist loyalist cabal and managed to liberate Hong Kong. In 2015, Japan, taking advantage of the forces of Arasaka, intervened in the Korean War, at the end of which the two states of the South and the North were united. Passing secret agreements with the unified Korea and Taiwan, the country of the rising sun strongly worried the European Council, which decided to exclude it from the EEC. In reaction, Japan created its own currency, the new yen. Under the impetus of Germany, Europe embarked on a clandestine war against the Japanese megacorporations to limit their presence on European territory. In 2016, the Third Corporate War broke out, pitting two financial megacorporations, Merrill Asukaga and Finch, and the Rothstein Foundation against each other. Unlike previous corporate wars, this one took place almost exclusively online, with each corporation using the services of different netrunners to carry out the attacks. Datacrash, the virus developed by Rach Bartmoss, had already begun to weaken the net's defenses, and these netrunners were able to attack the corporation's networks more easily, resulting in the loss of billions of exabytes of data. After a few months of war on cyberspace, the conflict came to an end with the intervention of NetWatch. In 2017, 7 large groups of nomad families, spread across the world, came together under the name of Nation. These 7 nations made agreements to work together in good understanding. At the same time, Mike Blair was re-elected, for the 3rd time, as President of the USA. For the first time, he appointed a woman as Vice President, in the person of Elizabeth Cress. While in Great Britain, royalist terrorists blew up the Thames flood barriers, so that London was completely submerged. Gradually, these loyalist forces succeeded in bringing down the authority installed by martial law, and the monarchy was restored with the coronation of Queen Victoria II. It was also in 2017 that the second O'Neill space colony was completed by ESA at Lagrange 3, and named Galileo. In 2018, seriously ill, US President Mike Blair is replaced by Vice President Elizabeth Cress. Nicknamed the Lady from NORAD, this former high-ranking American Army officer leads the government with a firm hand, but, considered incorruptible, she quickly manages to make herself appreciated by a much larger electorate than her predecessor, and seems to be the only one able to stand up to Gerald Hastings, a small protege of the corporations, who would like to take her place. Off the coast of Panama, the nomads of the Meta Nation, mostly ex-military, complete the construction of Meta Key, a floating city that becomes an independent nation, a tax haven and a popular asylum for pirates. A few weeks after its inauguration, the city moves to Tampa, Florida, to participate in its reconstruction. That same year, ESA completes the construction of Paradise Station, its 3rd O'Neill station located at Lagrange 4. In 2019, while synthetic drugs have replaced the natural narcotics of yesteryear for more than 20 years, Thailand and Laos managed to recreate poppy plants in secret and launch opium production. It is also from 2019 that the High Riders, as the inhabitants of the orbital colonies are now called, some of whom were born in space and have never seen the Earth, begin to revolt and demand that the ESA grant them their independence, eager to cut ties with the Earthlings and their endless problems. After long battles, the colonies of Galileo and O'Neill I declare themselves independent nations, while the Paradise Station colony is put under martial law. So here we are in 2020, the era of the cyberpunks. Under the firm hand of President Elizabeth Cress, the USA is gradually stabilizing, the country is slowly rebuilding, as evidenced by the first work undertaken by the Jodes and Aldecaldos nations to rebuild the city of Chicago. As for NASA, it is trying to catch up with the ESA by launching missions to Mars and Jupiter. Rumors are circulating about its plans to create the first manned base on Mars next year. But America is far from being out of the woods, still crushed by the social, ecological, and economic troubles that followed the collapse. And no one probably imagines that in less than 2 years, a series of new chaotic events will lead to the almost total destruction of the net. But that's another story.